stream. Instead of going over biology today, we're going over history. More specifically, Britain Transformed, theme 3 we're going to be covering today. And to be honest, out of every theme in Britain Transformed, this is the nicest by far. Like, this theme covers changes in classes, social values, women, and immigration, and race, which honestly is not bad at all. The hardest part of this topic is just remembering all the statistics, all the information, which is what I'm covering today. So let's crack on right away. I haven't done a history revision stream ever, so I don't really know how to format this, but I guess it's important firstly to cover the upper class. So we'll split this... That's a terrible pen. We'll split this into upper, middle, and obviously working. And obviously these all had significant changes pre-World War One and then post-World War One. So let's cover kind of their generic information. So upper classes are obviously the upper class. The features it says here: hugely wealthy, landowners, privately educated, social calendar. That's the main features. So not a lot there that you really shouldn't already know. Then the changes that we have is that World War One happened, and World War One affected the upper class significantly compared to these other classes. The idea that you need to get in your head is that a lot of the working class, these poor individuals, they were sick during the war. They were too unfit to fight compared to the upper class who aren't going to be unfit to fight. And therefore, I believe it's a statistic like 20%? 12%. 20, okay. Yeah. 20% of all old Etonians are going to die during World War One. This is a significant statistic because it already shows World War One has had a significant impact. This then leads us on to after the war, where a quarter of all gentry land is going to be sold by 1920, sorry, not 1940. So already, that is the overarching kind of idea. 20% of the upper class are going to die in World War One, which is going to lead to a quarter of gentry land being sold by 1920, mainly because the war was very expensive. And because the war was expensive, it leads to higher death duties and overall higher tax. So there you go. The consequences of World War One: 20% of the old Etonians die, you have higher tax rates, higher death duties, and a quarter of gentry land is going to be sold. This significantly is going to reduce the influence of the upper class, but politically, there is not going to be much decline. No real decline. There's going to be no immediate political decline of the upper class. However, there are some changes around this, mainly the idea that the Representation of the People Act is going to lead to more Labour MPs. Obviously going against the Conservatives, who at the time were obviously kind of the Etonians. The Labour MPs are more working class people, changing, the whole idea, adding more, working class MPs. So that's a kind of significant point there, actually, the Representation of the People Act. I don't know whether you would get asked a specific question about that act, but it is something to very much note, is that, you know, the Labour MPs' influence rose. What else does it say here that I've missed? The fall of wealthy landowners. The idea that 40% of MPs owned land, but by 1940 this was only 5%. And that shows a massive shift in the kinds of politicians / the upper class and their political influence. Also, the House of Lords changed, but the House of Lords in the late 50s was made so that there were life peers and not hereditary peers. So life peers replaces this is probably the most kind of easy one to understand. In the House of Lords, beforehand, you could just inherit a title based on your birthright. They changed it so that it was life peers. So, in other words, getting rid of that kind of continuancy of the upper class. And obviously, the life peers are politically nominated. But again, there was no decline of it. There was no decline in elite dominance in politics, mainly because Macmillan's government had a load of old Etonian cabinet members. So no real political decline, and we should establish that that's because of the new upper class, which focused on wealth over ancestry. For example, Macmillan's government. So already a lot about the upper class. We have a semi-decline of the upper class here, but then politically there's some changes, but overall there is still a massive influence of the upper class. A big idea is the rise of satire. And this basically broke apart class boundaries quite heavily by making fun of upper class figures and even MPs and PMs. Making fun of the upper class basically was something unheard of before. And so the rise of satire, it undermined the respect, and that's called deference. It undermines the deference. So, already, those are some huge changes in the upper class. Now, middle and working class, we can almost bunch together in a way, because the middle class are just, working class, who are mainly defined because they can buy houses. So, after World War One, there was this false idea, kind of almost a war between the middle and working class, where the middle class began to fear that the working class were advancing on them, getting higher wages. Wartime inflation contributed to this because middle class savings were affected. Savings affected by World War One. And that's wartime inflation. Middle class blamed the trade union strength for pushing up wages, so their savings have been affected by World War One / inflation, and they blamed union power. Just a little thing to talk about. I guess maybe you could get asked a question. If you get asked a question on unions, you could talk about how it led to a split between the working and middle class because of this, fear that it was union power. World War One spurred on middle class employment, so actually a big benefit was a 34% increase in employment. due to World War One. That's a very nice statistic there to include. Growth of respectable jobs in science, and clerking jobs for women. So, science jobs. For women. So more respectable jobs were the middle class. And home ownership became a feature of the middle class. %60 of middle class owners were homeowners. So about 60% of middle class owned homes, compared to 20% of working class. And finally, just one more idea is that the growth of the suburbs led to this idea that basically a separation from their place of work. You know, your house is separate to where you work, basically. So the growth of suburbs and when about was this? Just before World War II. Cool. Then we have the working class. So these are the unskilled and skilled labourers, people like that. Obviously, the Representation of the People's Act. This idea that many couldn't fight in World War One due to being unfit. And this actually brought a greater attention to that fact. So 31% were too unfit to fight. Rationing improved class health. That's a good statistic to include, 31% too sick to fight. Union membership rose. Union membership, World War One. We can just do some rounding here. 4 million to 8 million. So it basically doubled. Trade unions suffered a loss of membership. Loss of members post-war. They protected the rights of the working class, but again, obviously only the ones that had jobs, and aided in the rise of labour. World War II, the idea that it was a total war. This idea that World War II, all I can put there is total war. I know off the top of my head what that means. You know, you had things like rationing, which brought together a sense of collectivism. The idea that things like evacuee programs brought to light the issues that many working class had. Full employment in old industries. Ali's government saw the introduction of many welfare, so the impact of a welfare state. The welfare state brought the 1946 Industrial Injuries Act, which provided cover for those injured. That's pretty self-explanatory. Free universal healthcare. Rebuilding of some slum housing, and this was a limitation because it was limited led to isolation, and overall consumerism dissolved the class boundaries. So, that is a rough summary of the changes in the class. So if you were asked a question now, let's look at some exam question answers. How far did class and social values change between 1918 to 45? This would be a lovely question now, because we could talk about the decline of the upper class, but this is slightly limited because the new upper class rose. There wasn't really any political decline with the upper class, but there definitely was some, as you can see here. Rise of satire, again, this idea of changing social values, making fun of these upper class figures who would usually be respected, and this undermines the deference. You could talk about the growth of the middle class, the idea that this did drive a rift between the middle and working class, especially shown by 60% owning houses compared to 20% of working class. You could talk about World War I being a great benefit to the employment, leading to science jobs and clerking jobs for women, and then talk about the growth of the suburbs. Contrarily, we can talk about the working class and their growth, but it's not as significant as the upper class, definitely not. The idea that many couldn't fight in the war, which did bring attention to that fact, and rationing did improve health. Talk about the growth of union memberships, but this is limited because growth did stagnate after the war. Talk about the idea of the Industrial Relations Act, but if it's only talking about this time period, then yeah, you're going to talk mainly about how working class didn't change as much as the other classes. So, let's look at an exam question. Let's see if we can find one, actually, firstly. How do you agree that in the years 1918 to 51, changes to Britain's class structure were largely driven by war? Okay, good question. Yes, World War I changed classes here, but there were limitations. Yes, World War I led to a growth in jobs. It led to a greater divide in working class, which I guess you could argue isn't a change to the class structure. But then obviously later you would talk about World War II, how this eventually led to dissolving of class boundaries. It led to, this total war leading to full employment, leading to the creation of a welfare state, which massively benefited the working class. So, yeah. Decent question, I think. And you could talk about, so it's saying changes to Britain's class structure were largely driven by war. So you would talk about other reasons why they've been driven. And I've said here the idea of the welfare state being a reason. So talking about how actually it's the welfare state that brought a lot of changes to the lower class dissolving boundaries. But then you could also argue the impact of the trade unions, how that divided the boundaries more. I would probably mention the idea of the new upper class for that question, because you could talk about this whole section here. Or maybe the rise of satire as well. So that's a challenging question, because it rarely wants you to hammer in, has it been changed due to war? And obviously, one paragraph on World War I, one on World War II, and then you would need a counter paragraph, which, again, I would probably choose the idea of the welfare state, definitely. The idea of the growth of consumerism, too. Any other questions here? How accurate is it to say that living standards... Okay, is this living standards? How different was provision of welfare 1945 to 79 compared to 1918 to 39? That's a difficult question, to be fair. Social Security Acts you could talk about. I don't know what else you would talk about there, to be honest. Provision of welfare state is a topic I struggle with a lot. I don't remember anything about that. Then this question is living standards. So sustained improvement. I wouldn't know what living standards refers to. Because if you're talking about standards of living, you could talk about World War One leading to a growth in... No, that's probably theme 4, no? So that is a difficult paper, and I don't even know what paper that is. 2020. Okay, well that makes sense as to why it was a difficult and optional paper. Could be argued that social values did change. This began with the social revolution. Some historians argue. Changing social values would obviously link more into the idea of a liberal society, which, to be honest with you guys, to be completely honest, right? I am tired as fuck, and to be completely honest, I would spend more of this stream going over the liberal society. Because, okay, there's like 4 main aspects to this topic, right? You have changes in class, which is what we've just spent the last 20 minutes going over. Changes in social, which is the lib society. Then we have, changes with women, which is fairly easy, and then changes with race, which is things like immigration. So, out of all of those, I definitely struggle with these 2 the most. So, that has been a fairly decent and very quick stream. I am tired as fuck, to be honest. So my plan is, I'm probably going to go to sleep early tonight. Don't have history tomorrow, which means we don't have our mock until Tuesday. So tomorrow, I will jump in, and we will cover the liberal society, women, and we will brush over race. Reason I want to brush over it is primarily because race I've already done an exam question on, and it was a fairly decent question. Talking about, the Aliens Order Act and the idea that pushed divisions, it was fairly easy. Not